Welcome to the Kevin Mannix Report. I'm Kevin Mannix, your host for this program, which is designed to give all of us a little bit of insight into what goes on in terms of the personalities and the issues in politics in the state of Oregon. Our guest today is a gentleman who has established a solid reputation in his somewhat new role, not brand new role, as Labor Commissioner for Oregon, Jack Roberts. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate you inviting me.
I mentioned, of course, your position as Labor Commissioner, but one of the things we like to do in the show is get a little background information about folks involved in government. So I'd like to take you back a ways to your days as a young man growing up. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of where you're from and that sort of thing?
Sure. I grew up in Eugene. In fact, I like to tell people I went from grade school through law school without ever having to leave Eugene, because I went to the University of Oregon both as an undergraduate and got my law degree there, and then practiced law, and I still live in Eugene, raised a family there.
Well, when you just rushed through all of that, you still live in Eugene and you raised a family there and all of that. Can you give us a little idea what it was like going to law school, the University of Oregon Law School?
Well, law school is one of those experiences that it's nice to have behind you. As you know from firsthand experience, it's one of those things that is a great character test as well as an opportunity to learn a lot. But I thought the University of Oregon then was a great school. I still think it is. And it's a place that you can be exposed to a lot of different people and a lot of different opportunities, but we have good instruction there. I enjoyed the intellectual challenge, but also learned a lot about how to structure my time and to do things that I think have helped me later in life. And later when I got into law practice, I learned, as I'm sure you have, that practicing law is a lot different than learning about it, but it's a good experience.
When you were in law school, did you have any ideas of being in public service at some time, or have your plans dramatically changed over time?
Well, I've always been interested in politics and in government, and so in that sense I've always thought that that's something I might want to do. But certainly as I look at what I've done politically, where I was first a county commissioner down in Lane County and then labor commissioner, those are not jobs that ever occurred to me that I might want to do. It's a good example, I think, of how you can start out in life having certain interests and certain things that you're doing, but as doors open up, you have opportunities you never dreamed of, but if you take advantage of them, you often find that it's very rewarding and fulfilling.
Now, in terms of your work as a county commissioner before you became a labor commissioner for the state, can you give our viewers some idea what it's like to be a Lane County commissioner?
Well, first of all, in terms of county government generally, I think that cities and counties are really where the action is. That relates a lot more to the day-to-day lives of people than I think even the legislature, and certainly than what goes on in Congress. We often look at what's going on at the national level and at the state level, and it's these big macro issues, and they're very important. But when you're dealing at the local level with law enforcement issues, transportation issues, land use issues, even such things as locating solid waste dump, storage facility, whatever you want to call it, people don't want to live next to garbage, but we all create it. And so all these issues of how you deal with that, you really learn the extent to which government has to reflect and represent the people. Now in Lane County it's particularly a challenge because we are in many ways a microcosm of the rest of the state. We've got Eugene, which is a very urban area. We have rural areas. We go all the way from the coast to the mountains. We've got timber, we have agriculture, we have high tech, and we have people of all sorts of viewpoints and beliefs. And particularly in Lane County and around the Eugene area especially, they're not all shy about expressing those views. So it is a great opportunity to learn how to try to bring people from disparate backgrounds and disparate beliefs together to get things done. And sometimes you do and sometimes you don't.
Now, in office as a commissioner, did you find that party ideology was an important factor in the campaign and the election and then serving, or is that something that's less obvious than, say, in state legislature races?
It's far less for us because we were fortunate, at least I was personally fortunate, in that in Lane County, our commissioners are elected on a nonpartisan basis. I had run twice for the legislature as a Republican in Eugene. And that's where you want to find out what it's like to be a minority. Run as a Republican in Eugene. And so I did that a couple of times, figured, well, maybe politics isn't for me. Then I had a chance to be a county commissioner where we don't have party labels. And even though Lane County is one of the most democratic counties in the state, of the 5 commissioners we had, at the time I was there, 4 of us were Republicans. But since we got to take the label off and just run on our own beliefs, our own philosophies, our own records, we were able to do so successfully. And that's why when I was elected labor commissioner and the first Republican to win this seat in 40 years, I got the legislature to change this to also be nonpartisan and was reelected last year in a nonpartisan race.
I find it interesting that you mentioned that, in effect, when the filters were taken off the voters in Lane County were willing to look more at the individuals and their positions rather than their assumptions about the positions of these individuals. It sounds like that has an impact at the statewide level also.
I really think so. I think that there's too much of this stereotyping that goes on of political parties. There's probably too much stereotyping that goes on in life generally. And if we sometimes put away the filters, as you call them, and look at people for what they are, there are an awful lot of issues that are not Democrat or Republican. And I think of things like transportation and a lot of the difficult land use decisions. It would be hard sometimes to say what's the liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican view about that. You're really trying to take often two sets of people who live next to each other, who have very different views about what they want, and see how you can get them to live together and create a minimum of adverse impact on each other while still having the maximum opportunity to live the lives they want to live. And that's what a lot of politics is all about.
When you mentioned nonpartisan office, some folks may wonder, and they may think that means independent, but actually nonpartisan means just non-party, and you didn't have to, say, turn in your party registration to run as a nonpartisan candidate. You simply set that aside. It's not an issue in the campaign, and it's not a party nomination process. Do you want to expand a little on that so folks would understand?
I do, because sometimes people say, well, now you're nonpartisan, so you're not a Republican anymore. Of course I'm a Republican. I've been a Republican all my life, and within the Republican Party, I do think that we allow a lot of diversity of viewpoints. I think that's positive, that's healthy, but I like the fact that when I run for this office, or ran for re-election last time, I don't have to say, this is my party, and therefore let people make those assumptions that you talked about. It was interesting last time when we had a nonpartisan race, I was Republican, my opponent was an incumbent Democratic legislator, and pretty much everybody knew that. And a lot of the folks in the media said, well, this is supposedly nonpartisan, but it's really a classic Democrat versus Republican race. And I told them, no, I think that you may look at it that way, but most of the voters don't look at it that way. And sure enough, when we got ready to count the votes, I was fortunate enough to win every county in the state, including Multnomah County, which is where he was from, and that no Republican, if I had Republican after my name, there's no way I could have carried that county. But I think it shows people are willing to look past that and vote for the person.
As part of your experience as labor commissioner, you started out with a number of reforms, one of which was you suggested that the office be abolished. I don't know how much you've come to rethink that, but you've clearly tried to depoliticize the role of the labor commissioner, and I mean that in a positive way, and I'm not down on politics, of course, but in the sense of trying to make sure that you're focusing on getting results for the people with complaints, and also a willingness to turn aside the frivolous complaints and not keep those folks hanging on the line, so to speak. Well, gee, maybe you've got something here, maybe you've got something here. You've been willing to fish or cut bait. How has that dynamic worked for you in terms of running the office?
Well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate that. It is exactly what we've been trying to do, is to make the office less political. Under my predecessor, who I'll tell you I think actually had a good agency, I think she turned over a good agency to me, but it had gained this reputation of being a very partisan, very political, very ideological agency, sometimes unfairly. But because of that, many people felt that they would not be served fairly, even if that was an inaccurate perception. And of course, if that means people won't bring complaints or will end up settling claims that they should otherwise have opposed because they were wrong, simply because they wouldn't get a fair hearing, that affects the outcome. So we've worked hard to try to make this a more professional and a more administrative office, which is why I did try to get rid of the office that I hold as an elective office. We're one of only a handful of states that elect this kind of position. Most voters really don't know and understand what we do on a day-to-day basis. And so the accountability that normally the elected office would provide, I don't think is really there. And I'd like to take politics more out of it. Moving it to nonpartisan was a halfway step. I'd still like to see the legislature eliminate this as an elective office, maybe merge those functions in with some of the other workplace-related areas like workers' comp, unemployment insurance, occupational health and safety, OSHA. And I think we'd have a better, more professional agency even then. But as it is, we are trying to make sure that we do things in an impartial and professional way.
The folks who are opposed to changing the status of the position seem to focus on the idea that they like the idea of an independent watchdog agency which stands on its own. And this is a union spokesman in particular will bring up those points. Have you had any conversations with them about trying to allay their fears and concerns? And is there any progress on that front?
We have had discussions, and it depends on which part of the labor movement you talk to, how important they think it is. Most of the public employee unions feel very strongly it should continue to be elected. And perhaps that's because they see us as a place to turn to if their own employers within state government are not treating them fairly. And that's something that we have to take seriously. I think you can handle that in a different way, as they do in at least 45 other states. People in more of the blue-collar unions, the building trades, they are more interested in seeing the agency combined with other functions and work better. And if that meant giving up the elected office, they might be inclined to do that. If it brought occupational safety, for example, in with the wage and hour and brought some of those together and beefed it up. But what they want to do is make sure that if there is this change, it is a strengthening of the office and not a weakening of it, which I agree with 100%.
Now, one of the things we probably ought to do is pause and explain a little bit about what the Bureau of Labor and Industries does. Did I get the title right this time?
You
Bureau
did.
of, BOLI, Bureau of Labor and Industries. Why don't you give our viewers some idea of the operation itself?
That's a good point, because often people think that we do a lot more than we do. We basically have three main responsibilities. We oversee and enforce the wage and hour laws, civil rights laws, and we oversee apprenticeship programs, which are primarily, although not exclusively, in the construction trades. And those are really private sector on-the-job training programs that are education programs. They're a wonderful tool, but we're there to make sure that access is open to everyone, that they're truly getting the education they need, that people are advancing through the trade to become journey workers and then not simply being taken advantage of as cheap labor. In the other areas of wage and hour laws and civil rights laws, we're enforcing that to make sure that workers are treated fairly, they're compensated fairly, child labor laws are enforced, Oregon's prevailing wage law. We do all those things. We don't do workers' comp, we don't do OSHA, we don't do unemployment insurance, we don't do most job training outside of apprenticeship. And in some other states, all those things are part of one agency. And I think ideally they should be. All the workplace-related functions, I think, ought to be together, ought to be co-located. But frankly, even though we're not now in the same place, we have worked hard to try to improve the coordination and cooperation. I think we've made some real progress there. And that's a tribute, I think, to the entire system, that everybody's trying to work together. And I think that in that regard, it's maybe not as critical that we all be in the exact same place in the organizational chart. But long term, I think we would be best served if that were the case.
I'm curious as to whether the agency that you most have to coordinate with is the Department of Consumer and Business Services, or whether it be the Employment Department, or have I missed some other agency that you would work with a lot?
Those are the two main ones we work with the most, and probably overall, and also I guess I would say the Federal Department of Labor is another part of that. And of course, obviously, we're not going to consolidate with them, but the coordination there, and with the federal EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, we have good coordination there. But at the Department of Consumer and Business Services, with the Building Codes Agency, which deals with licensing issues that are very much related to what we do with apprenticeship, and they do the inspection of farm labor camps. We register or license the farm labor contractors. We also do a lot of coordination and work together. So we work more closely together. The Employment Department, we would not customarily work with as much. We have been working quite a bit with them lately because we contract with them to do the surveys on our prevailing wage rates that we set. And this is something new since 1995 that we've been doing to try to make sure that the rates that are set on public works contracts, which is the minimum rate that public agencies must pay, truly reflects the rate in the region and is not a premium rate where the taxpayer pays more than the average citizen would. So we're protecting against having cheap labor come into the state, driving down wage rates, driving down the economic condition of these areas, which is important. But we're also making sure the taxpayer gets a fair deal, and that's also important.
I'm going to pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on what used to be called Capital Insight, but is now the Kevin Mannix Report. I was told that I should change the name of the show so that people would recognize who the sponsor was or whatever, but in any event, you're with us on the Kevin Mannix Report. If you ever have any questions or concerns, I hope you'll feel free to call or write or contact me by email. You can call me in Salem at 503-364-1913, and our address in Salem is 2003 State Street, Salem, Oregon, 97301. We also have a very simple new email number, and in fact it's so new I don't know if it'll even show up on the screen in front of you, but you can now reach me at kevin@mannix.com. Yeah, that's right, K-E-V-I-N for Kevin at Mannix, M-A-N-N-I-X.com. I'm real pleased with having gotten that new email address, and yes, you can reach us at that address. And now we'll turn back to our guest today, our Labor Commissioner, Jack Roberts. The discussion we were just having about government structure and agencies comes to mind too, because you mentioned what I'll call farm worker housing or migrant worker housing, and it occurs to me that we not only have the folks from OSHA involved, but working with these folks, you get involved from another perspective. But there's also the Oregon Housing Department, which gets involved, and housing agency. And right now we're creating a new task force, where the legislature's created one that's looking at the issue of farm worker housing. And again, I think that really means migrant worker housing. Is this an area that you would like to have your agency involved in terms of discussions, or is this something that you think is mainly going to be looked at from the housing perspective? What's your outlook on this?
Well, I think there's a role for us as an information provider, and the data that we have on the numbers of migrant workers, which they don't have to register with us, but the contractors who hire them do, and they provide us with information that I think we can be helpful. Ultimately, I do believe, and I'm glad that this is being seen as a housing issue and part of the broader issue of how we provide housing for citizens generally, and not just as an isolated issue relating to migrant workers. And in particular, I think the notion that this could simply be forced onto the growers and the reforestation contractors, that they should just pay for all of this as a matter of course, is not realistic when they're operating, particularly in agriculture, in a global marketplace where they can't simply pass on all the costs to their consumers. And that we need to ask ourselves as a state, if we want to make sure we do not have substandard housing, or people living in substandard conditions, or people who are working with no access to housing at all, since currently the employer is not required to provide any, we need to get in the game and make sure that we understand the broader social implications of that. So I'm very pleased that we're doing this. Bob Repine, who's the head of the Housing and Consumer Services Agency, is or housing and whatever the name of that.
Whatever the latest name is.
Whatever that is, but that group is I think an important player, and Bob, because he was a home builder, he's been in the legislature, he understands that, is I think ideally suited to provide the leadership there. I'm pleased that it's happening.
Another issue that will always be with us, I think, is the question of children working both in the agricultural sector but in a variety of other sectors in society. And there's this constant tension. We certainly don't want child labor in the old-fashioned sense, or I hate to say it, in the modern sense, where children are exploited around the world. On the other hand, we hear from folks who say, gee, my kid's 14, 15, doesn't get a chance to work. How do you deal with those kinds of issues, and do you have some views about how we ought to make some changes?
I do, and unfortunately, a lot of these rules are really dictated by the federal government and some of the minimum standards. We here in Oregon have what's called a Wage and Hour Commission appointed by the governor, and we staff that, but it's a three-person commission that addresses rules that go beyond the federal here in Oregon. And I think we have a good group of people today. I think the governor has done a very good job of picking folks who represent a broader perspective. But we've worked very hard to try to make employment safe for kids, so they're not exploited, they're not endangered, but where kids will have opportunities to work. You know, it seems to me, if we had sat down 30 years ago and said, what can we do to increase juvenile crime and delinquency? If that had been our goal, we would have been hard-pressed to come up with a better strategy than saying, why don't we take both parents out of the home, put them in the workplace, then take the kids out of the workplace, send them home with plenty of free time and no supervision. Now, that wasn't our intent, but that's exactly what we've done. And as a result of that, there are a lot of kids that are getting in a lot of trouble, doing a lot of different things that are far more dangerous to them than actually having some productive employment. Nobody wants kids to miss school or to take time away from homework or other learning experiences to work. But when we have kids who often are without focus, without oversight, without discipline, and we think, could we get them into some work environments where they will actually be learning some of the important skills of life, some of which you are only going to learn on the job? Are we doing that, or are we simply turning them loose and letting their peers and others have the influence on them? And I think we need to rethink this very much.
Well, you've raised this, and there's an interesting context in the sense, if you look at the juvenile crime rates, they peak between 3 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon, the very time that we would hope that they might be working an after-school job, if they're not involved in after-school activities. Well, it sounds like we're going to have some additional opportunity to discuss this issue, because we are trying to look more and more at what we'll call the causes, or some of the causes, of juvenile crime. And There's a number of task groups that are addressing some of these issues. Do you expect that next session there'll be some opportunity to discuss ways that we can link kids up with more job opportunities, maybe go to the edge of what we're allowed to do under the federal standards, or are we pretty much hemmed in right now by the federal standards?
To a great extent, I think we're hemmed in when it gets to the younger kids, and unfortunately that's where, and that's probably less of the cases of the after school. I think there other types of activities and other types of oversight is more important. What I'm more worried about is during the summer months, when in days past, the kids used to go home this summer to work in the farms. Well, most kids don't live on farms now, and if you don't, your family isn't farming, you usually can't work on someone else's farm, and so consequently we have that. I think that's also an issue we're going to have to deal with in terms of our education system. Is we're one of the few industrial countries left where that says we're going to take 3 months off in the summer, and we need to be rethinking a lot of those things. And I would hope that in the next session we'd have a chance to deal with some of those.
When you mention our need to rethink things, it brings to mind what I've seen you do more of late, but actually you've been doing this all along. You've been willing to contribute op-ed pieces, to give speeches where you raise a variety of issues. As a statewide elected official in a nonpartisan position who happens to be a Republican, do you intend to continue sharing your ideas on a variety of these issues as they arise?
Well, I'll keep sharing them. We'll see how much longer they're going to be willing to print them. Actually, I've had some success lately in getting some of the newspapers to print pieces that I've written. I think it's one way to get the word out. I realize that a lot of people, sort of like in my family, where most of us turn straight to the sports pages or someplace else, but those people who read the editorial pages usually want to have a more thoughtful consideration of what the issues are, and it's one way that I have of communicating with people. And as a statewide elected official who has maybe a fairly narrow focus in my agency, but a broader interest in terms of the workforce. I'm the only elected official, statewide elected official, whose primary focus is the private sector rather than government. And so that does gives me an opportunity to talk about some things, and I intend to continue to take advantage of that.
Well, I noticed that some people were critical, and I'm not among them, seeming to think that you should put on some blinders and you should only be talking and writing about the specific duties of your office. And it seemed to me your response was you're a global person and you have a variety of issues, and yes, as an elected official you have some ideas you can share. People can accept them or reject them. I take it you're not getting defensive about this.
No, not at all. I mean, the fact is that, as I said before, I think this office ought to be part of the rest of state government. It shouldn't be an elected office. But the argument on the other side is, no, we need this elected office because it has higher visibility, more leadership and all that. Well, then I have to live up to that responsibility, provide the leadership, provide some of the vision, and if they don't happen to like it, then they can like somebody else.
As we head into another election year, and it seems like we're always in a session year or an election year, are you looking at you've already made it clear you're not running for any statewide office. Are you looking at pretty much continuing the dialogue you've started on a variety of issues, but also developing some legislation for the next session? Are there any dramatic changes that you expect to propose in regard to the Bureau of Labor and Industries?
At this point, the biggest question that I have to answer between now and, say, the middle of next year when we have to submit our pre-session filing for any bills is whether we want to take another run at trying to reconfigure, restructure this. This is really going to be my last chance before I leave office through term limits, and I'm going to give some real hard thought to it. I'm not interested in butting my head against a wall, and last time we were not successful, but I do think that there may be some opportunities to make some changes in reconfigurations. Other than that, I think we've done most of the changes that we want to make internally, and I'm going to concentrate over the next 3 years in trying to make sure we consolidate those changes, institutionalize them so that whoever follows me will hopefully be able to build on those and have new and better improvements, as I think we always should be striving for, but to make sure that what we have accomplished we don't lose because we have not built on a firm foundation.
Now, do you have any particular messages you would like to pass on to working folks if they have some certain kinds of issues in the workplace that you would encourage them to, if they can't resolve them amicably with their employer, or businesses who can't resolve issues with their employees? Do you want to give us a sketch of some of the things that your folks can deal with, and if you want you can talk about going elsewhere, but in particular what your agency can help out with?
The main things we deal with are, in terms of complaints from employers, wage and hour, where I'm not sure I'm being paid appropriately, I'm not being paid the right amount, or the employer saying, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to treat this. And we do have a web page. If I were as computer literate as you are, I'd be able to recite the web address. I can't do that, but I know it's BOLI, B-O-L-I, and I think it's state.org.us, US, whatever that is. So that you can find out, and we have information there. We have all of our administrative rules. We have that. But we also have people you can call and ask questions. In the civil rights discrimination area, we have the same thing available. The one thing I would say in the discrimination area is that there is no substitute, whether you're the employee or the employer, for talking these issues out and getting them on the table. Quite often we will have complaints, and they will be problems that have festered for a long time, and no one felt comfortable talking about them or dealing with them. And I would definitely encourage more communication on these issues, that if people are having problems, go to your employer, or if you're having problems with an employee, go to that person and try to explain and talk about it. But where you feel the door's been shut, or where you've been terminated unfairly, or where you have the problem, we are there to try to help. And I think that we can give you, without cost, an assessment of whether you have a case or not. And as you point out, we have, I think, gotten better at telling people who don't have a case, you don't have a case, getting them out the door, getting them on with their life, which is better for them and for everyone else. But where there is a legitimate case of discrimination, we can also take that through.
One of the things that you've just mentioned is a message I'd like to second strongly, which is communication and talking things out. I'm aware of a case from a few years ago where someone filed a discrimination complaint, and this was a woman who applied for a job, and she was a little bit over 40 years old, and the day she went into interview, there were several other women there under 40, and she complained of discrimination when she didn't get the job on the basis that, well, obviously the employer was going to hire someone younger. What she didn't realize was the person that the employer had hired was older than she was. Given that information, then she suddenly realized, whoops, no, her perceptions are incorrect. Just because you see a number of people in the waiting area on a given day doesn't mean that those are the only other candidates and one of them was hired. But to me, it was probably the clearest example of where a little bit of communication, like, gee, how old was the person that you hired, might have cleared up. This is in the days before BOLI would set aside frivolous cases quickly. So it took a little while to get to that point. One of the other things we both might do as lawyers is encourage people to communicate, because a lot of differences can be resolved that way without having recourse to agencies. Do you have, we've only got a couple of minutes left, do you have any particular message you would like to get out to the citizens in terms of how they ought to be looking at these issues for the future in terms of BOLI? Should they be contacting their legislators to talk about their perspective, or do you think this is the sort of thing that's going to be more on the esoteric government level?
I don't think that the public at large cares a lot about the structural issues and how it's organized, but what I do think that it's important that people think about and realize is that we are the place where a lot of people can turn when they believe, and often honestly believe, they've been treated unfairly. And they can find out whether it's also unlawful. And what we find in the majority of cases that come to us, and this is true all across the country, most of the time there's not a legal violation. But people need to know that as well. And we often find that when people come to us, we are their first recourse to find out whether they've really got a claim. And that's important. And I think that if people communicate to their legislators, I think this is an important thing to have, that'll help us a lot.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I'll say to our audience, we appreciate you joining us also. Our guest has been Jack Roberts, who is the Labor Commissioner for the state of Oregon. We will, again, be with you next time, and it's always a mystery as to who the next guest will be because of the way we schedule things. But thanks very much for joining us in this program.